All right. So welcome everyone to the 26th episode of the SFU Sports Analytics Virtual Seminar Series. Today we have Fabian Weigand. He's going to speak to us today about hydraulic models of human performance during high-intensity intermittent exercise. Fabian is a PhD candidate at the University of Western Sydney in Australia under the supervision of Dr. Jason Siegler in collaboration with Performance Sciences and the Center for Research in Mathematics and Data Science. His background lies in the field of computer vision, which he studied in Germany and Singapore. In pursuing his PhD, Fabian seeks to investigate opportunities in the area of performance modeling and to explore how applications in sports science can intersect with approaches in computer science in a way that is beneficial for both fields. So in the talk today, speaking about hydraulic models of human performance, and so physical performance commonly involves intermittent high-intensity efforts interspersed with periods of low-intensity activity or complete rest. Monitoring, predicting, and optimizing such performances is challenging. One approach to do so involves hydraulic models, which simulates the metabolic systems that supply energy for such efforts as three interconnected tanks filled with liquid. In this study, an updated hydraulic model is compared against W prime balance models, which are simpler models that are commonly used for modeling intermittent efforts in the field, sports science, research, and practice. The hydraulic model outperformed the W prime balance models for all metrics, even those that penalize models featuring higher number of parameters. These results incentivize further investigation of the hydraulic model as a new alternative to established performance models of energy recovery. So with that, welcome, Fabian. Thanks for joining us, and especially so early in the morning in Australia. So it's about 7 a.m. there, if I'm not mistaken. And,
it's 8 a.m. now.
What's that?
8 a.m.
8 a.m. Okay.
It's a bit better.
All right. So thanks for joining us on your weekend, and we really look forward to your talk. So I'm going to turn it over to you now to share your screen. Get started.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much. Let's just start sharing my screen. I hope you can see my screen now.
Looks good to me. So you're not quite in, you're not in full presentation view, but I'm not sure you need to be either.
I would like to be, but so I started the presentation, but it doesn't switch here. Just 1 second.
Okay.
This should look better, hey? Okay.
That's good.
Yeah. So thank you very much for this introduction. Yeah, so hi, I'm Fabian, and today I talk about hydraulic models of human performance during high-intensity intermittent exercise, which is a very wordy title, and I aim to go through this step by step. I'm a PhD at Western Sydney Uni, as Dave already introduced, and my supervisors are Oliver Obst at Western Sydney Uni and also Jason Siegler at Arizona State University. And we were very fortunate to work together with David Clark at Simon Fraser University for our most recent manuscript. And today I would like to talk about a few of our findings and overall what this means, hydraulic models of human performance during high intensity intermittent exercise. So for the first bit, I would like to talk about models of human performance. To me, this all is under the umbrella of the research area of performance modeling, which we can see as the abstraction of physiology. So we try to find mathematical models who abstract physiology. So on one hand, we have this complex human body that responds to exercise. And on the other hand, we have mathematical models that somehow try to explain or approximate responses that we observe. Another term I heard for this quite often is to call this a digital twin. So this is how these mathematical models often manifest. We have a computer program where you put your physiological parameters in, and then your digital twin, your computer simulation, gives you expected responses or helps you to optimize pacing schemes, or maybe gives you a training schedule that would be tailored for you. And yeah, as you can see here on the right, we focus on the area of cycling just because it's easier or the most easy to get power outputs of an athlete. You just put a power meter on a bike. And yeah, I would like to talk about some few underlying performance models for the start. One very common model here is the critical power model that covers energy expenditure. And this is also called the two-parameter model in the literature. And it's called two-parameter model because it has two parameters. And one parameter is critical power, or CP, and the other parameter is W prime. And you can see CP as a threshold. It's somewhat defined as the maximal work rate that can be maintained for a very long time without fatigue. So you can say if you work at a rate below critical power, you work at a sustainable rate. And as soon as you work above critical power, so at an intensity above critical power, that means you eventually will be exhausted. Fatigue will kick in at some point. And what limits the work that you can put out above critical power is this W prime capacity. So this is, you can consider this to be a battery. So as soon as you work above critical power, you have this capacity of work above critical power that limits how much energy you can spend there. And this down here is one famous depiction of this model. You see critical power is this red dashed line here. And if you have constant exercise intensity on the y-axis and then time to exhaustion on the x-axis, then you can see if you work at a constant exercise intensity below critical power, you can work for an indefinite amount of time, in theory. In practice, that's a bit different. But yeah, in theory, this is indefinite. But as soon as you work above critical power, your time is limited. And it's limited by this W prime constant. And the higher you go, the higher your intensity, the shorter is your time to exhaustion. So here in this example, we have P15. That's the intensity that's predicted to lead to exhaustion after 15 minutes. And after 15 minutes, the W prime capacity would be depleted and you reach exhaustion here. But then if you go a bit higher, because W prime is the same, your time would be a bit, would be more limited. So at P5, you would be exhausted after 5 minutes. Because of this constant, it turns out that it's such a curved linear function here with critical power as the asymptote. So as you approach critical power, your time to exhaustion approaches infinity. Another way to look at this would be in this way, where W prime is not a constant now. We look at W prime is still a constant, but we look at W prime balance now, which means W prime balance tells us how much of W prime we have left. So if your athlete would work below critical power for the beginning, nothing happens to W prime balance. Then the athlete works above critical power. And now we have to utilize this W prime energy, so this additional capacity to meet the power demand. And therefore, we subtract the difference to critical power from our W prime capacity. So our W prime balance drops in this linear way. Then here for 3 minutes, the athlete works at critical power, so nothing happens to W prime balance. And then here in the end, the athlete works at a very high intensity. So W prime balance drops quickly, reaches 0 at this point, and then exhaustion would be reached. So here exercise has to be stopped. But this critical power model only looks at energy expenditure. But if we want to use models of human performance for high intensity intermittent exercise, we also need models that explain recovery to some extent. So just a short example for what we mean by intermittent exercise. In cycling, this could look like a course like this. So here a cyclist would start this course and would have to ride up this hill. So there would be a high energy demand to climb this hill. But as soon as the peak is reached, there would be some phases of recovery possible. So here some energy recovery would be possible as the athlete rides down this hill. And then for the last final bit here, there's another steep climb. So here again, a lot of energy is spent. And ideally, the athlete would reach this finish here with all the energy spent. So W prime balance would be ideally 0 at this end here. Then the course would have been done in the most optimal way. And such performance models would help to find the optimal pacing scheme here. But we would also need to have a perspective on energy recovery. And this is how it plays out when we add recovery to the equation. So now we have a combination of the critical power model for energy expenditure and also an equation that we call W prime Skiba in this example. So this is an equation that was published by Skiba and colleagues in 2015. David Clark was involved there too. So this is actually Skiba and Clark. And this equation assumes a mono-exponential recovery. So here we work below critical power in the first bit, then above critical power for the next 3 minutes. So again, W prime balance drops in this linear way. And then we work below critical power again, and W prime balance comes back. So this is our first phase of recovery in here. And you can see that this is not linear, how the energy comes back. This is a mono-exponential recovery equation. And this recovery depends on the exercise intensity below critical power. So the lower the intensity, the faster it comes back. You can see this here in the later recovery bout. Here, the slope is a bit steeper, how energy is regained, because in general, the exercise intensity is lower and also a bit more was depleted. So this mono-exponential recovery depends on exercise intensity below critical power. And then here in the end, a lot is regained, but then energy is spent at a high rate again. We are close to exhaustion, but not quite yet. And here we work at critical power, so nothing comes back. So here at critical power, still there's no change to W prime balance, no recovery, no expenditure. And this is one perspective on how these energy dynamics play out throughout the course. But this is not the only recovery or expenditure model out there. There are a few other models that also try to predict the same thing. So there's another equation called W prime Bartram that Bartram and colleagues published in 2018. And they observed recovery dynamics on elite athletes and in general found that W prime balance comes back quicker in their cohort. So for elite athletes, they suggested that recovery is a bit quicker than the W prime Skiba equation suggests. And then there's a third model depicted here that we call W prime balance integral model. So this model applies a convolutional integral to the whole exercise data. And it's a bit different because it assumes a constant recovery, even during energy expenditure. And therefore, because of this ongoing recovery, we don't have a linear energy expenditure anymore. But in general, the model assumes a slower recovery speed. So we have these much slower recovery dynamics during recovery bouts here. But because of this ongoing recovery assumption, we also have energy recovered during exercise at critical power. So yeah, these are just 3 examples. There are even more models out there. And if you look at the 15-minute mark here, for example, you can see that all these models vary quite a lot. So you can imagine here the orange model, the W prime balance integral model, would predict much less than the Bartram equation in this case. So depending on which model you pick, you would get very different optimal pacing strategies for a course. Or just in general, the predictions would differ quite a bit depending on what model you pick or what conditions you have. And one question that started my PhD investigations was, why do these models vary so much? Why do we have so many models that try to predict basically the same thing, but they all have different predictions and turn out to be quite different to each other? And one explanation that we found, or one possible reason, is that performance models are fitted to exhaustive exercise tests. Just to have an example, I would like to go over the process how critical power and W prime are ideally estimated. So with the gold standard, these are usually estimated from 4 to 5 exhaustive exercise trials, which means we have a cyclist on a cycle ergometer, and we set this cycle ergometer to a high intensity. So for example, 500 watts, like we have it down here. And then the cyclist would have to exercise at this intensity until they can't physically push the pedals anymore. So until total exhaustion is reached. And then we record this time that this intensity could be maintained for. So in this example, this is roughly 2 minutes. And then we let the athlete rest for maybe 24 or 48 hours until we can assume that the athlete is fully rested. And then we do a second trial at another intensity. So for example, 340 watts. And again, the athlete has to maintain this intensity until total exhaustion is reached, until they can't physically push the pedals anymore. And we record this time to exhaustion. So with each time to exhaustion trial, we get one of these data points. And once we have 4 to 5, we can fit this curvilinear relationship to it. And then the asymptote is our critical power, and our W prime is the constant. So if you remember this rectangular area. And you can imagine these tests are very demanding on the athlete. So these tests really hurt. You have to exercise until you can't physically exercise anymore. And if you are a professional athlete, it's hard to fit these tests into your usual training schedules. And because you have to be fully rested for them, it kind of disrupts your usual training cycle. But that's not everything. So in this case, we would determine critical power and W prime. But if we look at energy recovery, these tests are even more demanding. Here's one example protocol, how we estimate recovery. There are more other protocols out there, but this is one protocol that's often used and that we also used in our manuscript. In this protocol, you have to do 2 time to exhaustions in a row. So it plays out like this down here. you would start exercise with a warm-up below critical power, and then you have to do one time to exhaustion exercise trial, which we call work bout 1 here. So exercise switches to an intensity above critical power, and you have to exercise until you can't push the pedals anymore, until total exhaustion is reached. And according to the critical power model, we can then assume that W prime balance is fully spent at this stage. So W prime balance is at 0. And then instead of stopping the exercise, we switch to a recovery intensity. So here we switch to recovery intensity, and this recovery intensity is maintained for a fixed amount of time. So here for 2 minutes. And then we switch back to the exercise intensity that the first walk bout was at. So here it's a second time to exhaustion at the same intensity. And again, the athlete has to push the pedals until it's physically not possible anymore. And we record the second time to exhaustion too. And because we could assume that W prime was fully spent at this point here, after the first time to exhaustion, everything that was that the athlete was able to push out in this second work bout was what's regained in this recovery bout. And then we can say the ratio of the second work bout to the first work bout is how much was recovered. So in this example, we had a first time to exhaustion of 4 minutes, and then a second time to exhaustion of 2 minutes. Therefore, 50% was recovered in this recovery bout in between. So you can imagine time to exhaustion trials already hurt, but if you have to do 2 of them in a row, this hurts even more. And this is even harder for elite athletes to fit in their training schedules. And if you have to determine critical power and W prime, and then also want to have some recovery estimations, there are a lot of tests required. And yeah, it's a big ask for an elite athlete to conduct maybe 10 or 14 of these tests to get a general picture on how energy expenditure and recovery works out for them. And this is one explanation for this variation. So tests are very demanding. Therefore, models that are applicable, that elite athletes can use, they have to simplify a lot because we only have a few data points to fit to. And therefore, we need simple models that can be fitted to these few data points. And recent research suggests that these simple models that are used at the moment might even simplify too far. And therefore, or not therefore, but this is suggested because Kane and colleagues found some possible improvements for better predictions. And because we have more time today, I would like to go over these suggested improvements in a bit more detail. So one thing about these models that Kane and colleagues tackled was that the recovery estimations according to the W prime ski bar and also the W prime Bartram equation, they only depend on the exercise intensity during recovery. So if you have the same recovery intensity, recovery dynamics always play out in the same way. So if we would have a theoretical course like this, where first an athlete works at a comparably low exhaustive exercise intensity, which is P15 in this example, so predicted to lead to exhaustion after 15 minutes, then W prime balance drops to 0 after 15 minutes. And then we switch to the recovery intensity. And according to these established equations, energy comes back in roughly 25 minutes. So this is the W prime ski bar equation in this example. Bartram would be a bit quicker. And then if the athlete would do an exhaustive exercise at P5, which is predicted to lead to exhaustion after 5 minutes, then recovery would play out in the same way afterwards because W prime balance is 0 and we are at the same recovery intensity. But what Kane and colleagues observed is that recovery should take a bit longer after a longer exhaustive exercise bout. So if you work at exhaustive exercise intensities that take a bit longer to be exhausted, for example, P15, then your recovery takes a bit longer. And if you push out all your energy, all your W prime that you have in 5 minutes, then recovery is a bit shorter. And to me, this fits to the general notion. If you think in the extremes, for example, if you have a marathon runner that spends all their energy during a marathon, then you would imagine, okay, recovery will take a long time. But if you compare this to someone who does an all-out 100-meter sprint, you can imagine that after a sprint, you might recover quicker than after a whole marathon run, even though in both cases, you would have spent all your energy. In one case, in a very short time, in the other case, in a very long time. Yeah, this is a bit of an extreme comparison, but this is what this means. So longer recovery after lower exercise intensity. And these are the conditions that Kane and colleagues observed. They observed, or they conducted 4 different exercise trials on their athletes, and they investigated 4 different conditions. So we have one condition here, exhaustive exercise intensity at P4. So this is a high exhaustive exercise intensity. And then this transitions into a lower recovery intensity. So what you see here, P4 predicted to lead to exhaustion after 4 minutes. And then CP33 means 33% of critical power. So high exercise intensity, low recovery intensity. 33% of critical power is quite low. And then they compared this to other conditions. So here, after this high exercise intensity, recovery after 2 minutes was around 50%. What we have here are the mean values of the investigated athletes of the whole group. Unfortunately, we don't have standard deviations here because they were not reported by Kane and colleagues. So we have to work with these mean values here at the moment. But yeah, the mean recovery after 2 minutes was 50%. Then here in between 50 and 75, and after 6, we were close to 75. But then if athletes worked at a lower exercise intensity, so exercise intensity P8, so exhaustion after 8 minutes, or predicted exhaustion after 8 minutes, then recovery was a bit slower. So here after 2 minutes, we are below 50%, then at 50% after 4 minutes, and a bit above after 6 minutes. And all these mean values are lower than in the P4 condition here. And then here they did a similar trial setup, but with a higher recovery intensity. So here recovery is at 66% of critical power. And again, after the higher exercise intensity, recovery was a bit quicker than after a lower exercise intensity. And in general, you can also see that these established models fit these observations only in a few of these conditions. So down here, the W prime Skiba equation is closer in the 2-minute recovery case. But then up here, it's the integral model that is closer to these observations in this case here. So what Kane and colleagues suggested from this is that an incorporation of this exercise intensity would help these exercise recovery models to predict these recovery ratios a bit better or a bit closer. And this is not the only thing that Kane and colleagues observed. There's a second improvement that they suggested this year. This year, they published a study where they investigated one recovery condition in more detail. So they looked at these recovery ratios in many different timeframes in one condition. And they observed that for short recovery timeframes, recovery is quite quick, but then it slows down a bit for the longer timeframes. So if you recover for 10 minutes or 15 minutes, recovery slows down a bit, and you're not at 100% as these established equations up here suggest. And they suggested that a bi-exponential model is actually what explains these recovery dynamics a bit better. So all these established models at the moment suggest mono-exponential recovery, but such a bi-exponential model here seems to be much closer to what they observed in their investigations here. So we have 2 suggested improvements. We have the incorporation of previous exhaustive exercise, and we have bi-exponential recovery dynamics. But this leads us to a...
Sorry to interrupt, but there's a question from Dr. Schreier. He asks, so the result suggests that C33 creates faster recovery than C66. Is this true?
Yes. Yes, this is right. Sorry, I tried to open up the chat to see the question.
I can repeat it. So he's basically asking, is this CP33 is faster recovery than CP66?
Yes. Yeah, this is right. Yeah, I see the question now too. Yeah, this is correct because CP33 would be 33% of critical power. So this is quite a low recovery intensity. But then if we look at CP66, this is 66% of critical power. So recovery intensity would be a bit higher. And at a higher intensity, recovery is suggested to be a bit slower. So this would be correct. Yeah, it's maybe a bit confusing because the number is higher. Oh no, it's actually the right way. So recovery intensity is higher, so less energy comes back. You work at a higher recovery intensity, so you can recover less. I hope this makes sense.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the question. please jump in if there are more questions like this. Let me just close the chat for a moment. So back here, we have this incorporation of bi-exponential recovery dynamics and also preceding exercise intensity. So this leads us to this dilemma. We now have this necessary trade-off. So we on one hand, we need simple models because we have limited data points that we can fit to, and we want models that are applicable for elite athletes. But on the other hand, we have a lot of variation in these models that we can use. And recent findings suggest that we need more complex models. So yeah, it's a general dilemma in performance modeling, I believe. And to put this in another perspective, we can now separate models into two classes. We can say on the left side, we have applicable models that we currently look at. So all these models require relatively few tests to be applied, and they have a high abstraction to be fitted to these few tests that we have. So these are models that we looked at so far. And on the other hand, we have complex models. These complex models require extensive tests and are able to model performance in more detail. So these complex models would be able to incorporate these findings by Kane and colleagues, but we would need more tests to apply these to an athlete. And now finally, this is the first mention of hydraulic models, which my PhD topic is actually about. So now I would like to introduce hydraulic models, which are on this right side, on this complex model section. And hydraulic models of human performance were originally designed to model metabolic energy sources within a human body. So what you see here is a 3-component hydraulic model that was designed to simulate metabolic processes during exercise. And the first 3-component hydraulic model was proposed by Margaria in 1976, but later Morton built upon Margaria's work. And what you see here is Morton's suggested 3-component hydraulic model. He published some mathematical equations to define these dynamics of the model and proposed that the configuration that you see here is the final one that should be used. So what do you see here? What you see here is a system of 3 tanks. You have a left tank, a middle tank, and a right tank. And each of these tanks is filled with liquid. And liquid flow in the system represents energy flow. And on the left side here, you have an infinitely big tank. That's what's indicated by these fading lines. So liquid in this tank is, we have an infinite amount of liquid in this tank. So liquid flow through this pipe represents sustainable energy production. And Morton labeled this tank O for oxidative sources. So this is the sustainable energy source of the human body. Energy that comes from here is sustainable. So you could say this is something like working below critical power. So energy from here is of infinite capacity. We can work at these energy rates for an indefinite amount of time. But then this infinitely big tank is connected to a limited tank here in the middle. And this tank is labeled P for phosphocreatine capacities. And then we have a second limited tank here on the right. And this is labeled G for glycogen capacities. And phosphocreatine is the fastest pathway in the human body to create energy. So whenever you start a sprint or if you move fast, phosphocreatine is utilized to meet this immediate energy demand. So this is your metabolic pathway that reacts the quickest, but also has the smallest capacity, the smallest amount of energy available. And we have a tap attached to this tank down here. This tap represents energy demand. So we open and close this tap according to energy demand. And you can imagine now, as we open this tap, liquid will flow out of this middle tank. So liquid level drops here. And as liquid level drops here, liquid pressure is less on this pipe entrance here. So liquid flow from here will ramp up the more liquid flows out of this middle tank. And then we have this third tank called glycogen capacities. This is a big energy source, so there's a lot of energy available, and also this pipe here is quite wide. So this is a strong energy source, but it's limited. It's not sustainable like the oxidative one. And in general, it's a bit slower to respond. So if we open this tap, this is the first one to respond. The most energy flows out of here. Flow from here will slowly contribute. And as soon as liquid level drops below here, from a lot of liquid from here will flow through this pipe as well and contribute as well. And this tube here on the side is just to account for early lactic acid observations. It does not really contribute to the flow dynamics. And in the equations by Morton, it's not even considered. but it's just here to make sense from a metabolic perspective. Just to give more sense to this, it's always easier to explain things when they move. I would like to show these dynamics in a simulation, but I would like to talk about these dynamics in context about what we talked about earlier, about the suggestions by Kane and colleagues that after a lower exercise intensity, recovery would take longer, and after a high exercise intensity, recovery is a bit shorter. So just 1 second, let me bring this up. Here we go. So this is a model like I saw it earlier. The only thing that's missing is the tube up here. And I can open and close this tab now according to energy demands. So I opened this tab down here, and you see out of the middle tank, also out of our phosphocreatine capacities, liquid drops now. And as liquid drops, the flow through here slowly ramps up because liquid pressure against this pipe here gets less and less. So more can flow through this pipe into here. And now that the liquid level drops to this stage here, now the slower tank, the red tank, can contribute as well. And you see flow here ramps up as well. Now I increase this a bit more just to speed this up. So you see liquid level here drops now slowly too. Flow here increases. And now as this liquid level reaches this pipe exit here, this flow would be at a maximal capacity. So this pipe has a maximal capacity, which is 249.8 in this case. And now the athlete would be close to exhaustion. Now exhaustion is reached because the energy demand down here at the pipe can't be matched by these two flows out of these tanks anymore. So here, the energy demand is too high. Exercise has to be stopped because the body cannot produce enough energy anymore to meet the demand. So from here, we could now switch to recovery intensity. And you see, after this comparably low exercise intensity, it's still not very low, but comparably low maybe, you see that this tank is depleted by 1/3. So if I switch to recovery intensity now, you will see that liquid from here flows back into the middle tank. And eventually when this liquid level here reaches this stage here, then the flow here will reverse, and then liquid from the middle tank also flows into the right tank. And at some point, the whole system will be refilled again by this sustainable tank here on the left. So this simulates our recovery. And if I now redo this simulation with a much higher intensity, so I just pick a unrealistically high number now, just to make it quick. You see now that exhaustion is reached already, and less liquid from this right tank could contribute. So exhaustion is reached after a short time. And if I switch to recovery intensity now, you can imagine that recovery will be quicker because less liquid is flown out of this right tank. So in general, these tanks will be refilled quicker. So with these dynamics, the 3-component hydraulic model is able to address the suggested improvement by Kane and colleagues, which I found very promising when I saw this model for the first time. But this leads us back to this complexity issue that we talked about earlier. The 3-component hydraulic model is on this right side here. It's a very complex model, and every tank has to be adjusted according to physiological parameters. And it's hard to know what the exact phosphocreatine capacity of a human body is, or how much glycogen a human body has available. And also, the position of these tanks has an effect on how these flow dynamics play out. So how big should this tank be? Where should these pipe entrances and exits be? And what are the maximal flow capacities of these pipes? Every parameter of this model in Morten's perspective has some metabolic or physiological meaning. And sometimes it's very hard or even impossible to obtain these measures for an individual human body. So we have this issue now. We have this promising model that might allow to incorporate these suggestions by Kane and colleagues, but we cannot really apply it to individual athletes. And for my PhD topic, we made this our goal. We wanted to make the 3-component hydraulic model applicable to individual athletes. And this now leads me to what we did for our manuscript or for our first work. We generalized this 3-component hydraulic model by Morten further. The first thing we did was to remove this pipe up here because it was not really considered in the mathematical equations anyway. And since we want to generalize the model, this tube is not really important anymore because we don't consider lactic acid observations. And then we generalized these components and changed their understanding. We said the left tank is now just an unlimited energy source, not oxidative sources anymore. The middle tank is just a limited fast energy source. And the right tank is just a limited slow energy source. And this gave us much more freedom. Now we could say, okay, this is not tied to glycogen or phosphocreatine anymore. We can adjust these components much more freely. And this leads us to a model that has 8 parameters that we can adjust, freely, not tied to any metabolic measures anymore. So we have this height here for the left tank. We have a maximal flow capacity from this tank. We have tank capacities for each component and maximum flows between them. And we have this height to the top and to the bottom of the slow tank. This sums up to 8 parameters. And now we developed an optimization approach to fit this 3-component hydraulic model to exercise responses that we already have or that we can obtain with the protocols that we know. So back to these models that we talked about earlier, we said we assume energy expenditure according to the critical power model. So we would have time to exhaustion trials that we can fit this model to, and then assume this linear utilization of W prime as our energy expenditure model. And we take these measures that Kane and colleagues took for recovery. So we had these 4 different conditions and these 12 mean observations on the athletes that they published, and say, for our 3-component hydraulic model, we want the model to behave like the critical power model in terms of energy expenditure. And we want the model to behave like these observations that Kane and colleagues published in terms of energy recovery. So we reformulated the problem like this. We want to fit these 8 parameters of the generalized 3-component hydraulic model to these observations that we have. So we took the group average W prime, the group average critical power, and the group average recovery observations by Kane and colleagues, and try to fit such a system of tanks to these observations. One way to do this is evolutionary computation. Here I want to give a special shout out to PyCo, which is a very useful library for this purpose. It's maintained by the European Space Agency and by Biscani and ISO, and turned out to be a great tool to find or to develop an algorithm that works for this problem. And just again, to show what this actually means, I would like to show a simulation here too. Just 1 second. So here on the left side, we have an arbitrary 3-component hydraulic model now. And here on the right side, you see these 8 parameters of the model. And if I click random, you can just, these are just random hydraulic models now. And you can adjust these parameters. So this is the capacity of the middle tank, capacity of the right tank, maximum flow from the left tank, and tank heights maybe. Let me adjust this a bit. I drop down this a bit. So this is just a very arbitrary model now. These are no educated guesses. And now I can use this model and let this model simulate all these exercise trials that are necessary to determine critical power in W prime, and also to determine the recovery observations that Kane and colleagues published. So I let this model simulate these. And you see, at the moment, this model does not predict these expected responses very well. So the blue line is what we expect, the hyperbolic relationship according to the 2-parameter model. The green line is what this model here predicts. So we have much longer time to exhaustions in the high intensities. And here in the lower intensities, time to exhaustion is so long that we cut it off here. So here the maximal time to exhaustion is reached 5,000 seconds. And then here recovery ratios for this case here look quite okay, even better here in this case. But down here recovery does not really happen. So we would say this model here performs quite poorly and does not give us the responses that we expect. So we would have to adjust these parameters a bit. Maybe wiggle this around. I think this is too high. This is way too high. And estimate again. Okay, I could not improve it much. Here it's a bit closer, but time to exhaustions look even worse. So this is our optimization problem. We have to find these parameters that recreate these expected responses in the best way. And with the evolutionary algorithm that we found, we could do this. So this is one fitting that this evolutionary algorithm produced. And if I run the simulations now, this model here responds how we would expect it to. So here, this hyperbolic relationship is matched very well. And also these recovery estimations or observed recovery ratios by Kane and colleagues are matched quite well. So this is promising. We use this evolutionary computation approach and fit our generalized three-component hydraulic model to these responses or to these exercise trials that are already conducted on athletes. And we propose this is a pathway to apply this model to individual athletes. And now we were interested in how does this perform? So, one very promising thing that we found was that the three-component hydraulic model incorporates previous exercise intensity and is able to predict these different recovery ratios according to previous exercise intensity. But it also models recovery as a bi-exponential function because of this interplay with these two tanks. So here, what you see is a three-component hydraulic model fitted to the average W prime and critical power that Kane and colleagues published in 2021. So the average critical power and W prime of the athletes that they investigated in this study. And the three-component hydraulic model predicts recovery ratios close to what they observed in their conditions here. So remember, all these models here are not fitted to these observations that you see here. These are the observations that Kane and colleagues published in 2021. And the three-component hydraulic model is fitted to recovery estimations that Kane and others published in 2019. But still, the recovery ratios here are matched, well, more accurate than the established models do. It's still not perfect. If you compare to the fitted bi-exponential model that Kane and colleagues fitted to their observations, you can see that the hydraulic model over-predicts in the shorter time frames and under-predicts in these intermediate ones. But this bi-exponential one has been fitted exactly to these measures, while the hydraulic one hasn't seen these before. So in general, we argue that this is a promising finding. And we compared the hydraulic model to established W prime balance models on more data. We extracted data from 5 different recovery studies and compared predictions with root mean squared error, and also investigated the trade-off between explanatory capacities and model complexity with the archaic information criterion. And our findings were that the hydraulic model outperforms established W prime balance models on these 2 established metrics. And therefore we said, these results really incentivize further investigation of the hydraulic model as an alternative to these W prime balance models. So at the moment, it looks like this is a step into the right direction to make this generalized three-component hydraulic model applicable to individual athletes and maybe provide a model that is able to address these suggested improvements by Kane and colleagues and maybe helps a bit with the variation that we observe in the current models. But of course, there's more work. We have only compared the three-component hydraulic model on data from 5 studies. And there's much more data needed to get a more holistic picture whether this hydraulic model is really a valid alternative and where the advantages and disadvantages of this model are. We are currently aiming to conduct our own study, and we are always looking out for collaborations. So if someone has data available that they would like to apply these models to and compare to, it would be absolutely amazing if you reach out. And we're looking for every opportunity to compare these models in a more holistic way. It's actually quite hard to find data to compare these models on. And specifically for the hydraulic model, the fitting process, how it is at the moment, this evolutionary fitting process is complex and time demanding. On a strong computer, it takes about 3 hours to find such a fitting. We have some controversial recovery dynamics during exercise at critical power. So W prime balance models suggest that W prime balance does not change during exercise at critical power. But if a hydraulic model simulates exercise at critical power, there are still internal flow dynamics going on. And here I would like to refer to our manuscript if you are interested in this and if you read more about this. In our future work section, there's a chapter about this controversial recovery dynamics, and some cases are highlighted where this turns out to be a bit unexpected. And also an investigation is important of which physiological parameters still apply. So we generalized each of these components as unlimited energy source, limited energy source, and limited fast energy source at the moment. But it would be interesting to see how close the correlation to phosphocreatine capacity still is, or to aerobic and anaerobic capacities. So there's a lot of future work possible too. But in general, now to show the entire title again, this is what we mean by a hydraulic model of human performance during high intensity intermittent exercise. Our hope is that in future, cyclists can use such fitted 3-component hydraulic models for their predictions to find optimal pacing strategies and maybe find some more accurate predictions for their optimal strategies, or maybe can make use of physiological parameters that can be inferred from these tank sizes and capacities for their own training schedules or training plans. So this is what we hope. Let's see what the future holds and what we can show about this. So thank you very much. If you're interested in this, please, if you're interested in the code, you can visit my GitHub. There are 2 Python packages available. The 3-component hydraulic package allows you to recreate these animations, and you can create some of your own fittings and investigate if you want to. And the PyperMod package allows you to recreate all these plots that you saw in this presentation, and also contains the data that we used for our manuscript. So if you want to compare models yourself, use the PyperMod package. This stands for Python Performance Modeling. Or if you want to fit your own 3-component hydraulic models, have a look at the 3-component hydraulic package. And yeah, if you want to chat about this, or maybe are interested in some collaboration, please reach out. It would be great to hear from you. So thank you very much.
Great stuff. Thanks very much, Fabian. So we'll take questions from the floor. I don't see anything in the chat forum, so please just flip on your video and ask away.
Yeah, so to open up the chat again.
Hi, Fabian, it's Ian Schreier here.
Hello.
Hi. So I did work on fatigue, embarrassingly, 40 years ago. 30 years ago, I guess. I'm so old that I can't count anymore. There's a couple of things that struck me. First of all, it's really restricted to intermittent high intensity exercise, because you used the example of a 100-meter sprint and a marathon runner, and that's very different exercise. So I just wanted to make sure that all these models are intermittent high intensity exercise. That's correct, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Maybe the marathon is not a great example. That's right.
Yeah, and just the whole mechanisms of fatigue are different. Like in all of this, I get the sense that the whole model is about energy availability, which is a gross simplification of fatigue in itself. So I'm amazed that that the models actually fit as well as they do. I'm very happy about the model that you showed from your evolutionary one, because for me, that's what fits with the way I learned and I understand energy availability from oxidative phosphorylation, creatine phosphate, and glycolysis. Like the first model you showed, the little picture you have up there, was not the way I would have drawn that hydraulic picture. I would have a priori drawn it the way your evolutionary model did, or much more. Okay, and if you want, you can email me and we can set up a Zoom, and I don't want to get into why, but it just fits with everything that I learned when I was doing my PhD in fatigue. What I was curious about is that in the fatigue, if you take a muscle cell and you expose it to a low pH, you drop the force, and then the force drops just because of the lower pH. So that'll look like fatigue. And then if you restore the pH, it takes some 2 hours for the cell to recover. So it's got nothing to do with energy availability. And you said that you left out the lactate. And I'm curious if that tube that you went up to the lactate, if they had ever modeled that as creating I'm going to call it weakness instead of fatigue, but doesn't matter, because it's not due to the energy sources, it's due to the entire muscle actually just not being able to generate as much force anymore. Has anybody written about this? Because I really haven't read any of this in years and years.
So in general, yes, I think that this has been acknowledged. And the way this has been acknowledged is that it's ignored. So in general, fatigue is not really considered in these models. It's only about energy availability from these sources that are depicted. And measures of fatigue, or yeah, maybe also efficiency on how you spend your energy, this does not change. It's yeah, these are important things that should be incorporated and are not at the moment. Yeah, it's a very good point. Yeah, it's just hard because the more you try to add these things into the hydraulic model, the more complex this model gets. And you might end up with a model with dynamic flow capacities and 5 tanks, and it just gets more and more complicated. And eventually you try to recreate a human body as a hydraulic system. So it's also about choosing the right approximation for the use case that you're looking at.
Great. Yeah, thanks for the question, Dr. Schreier.
Yeah.
Any other questions? So maybe I'll ask one just while we're waiting. So you mentioned that you know, like finding data is an issue. Now, of course, we have like companies that produce or you know that have these online competition software and whatnot. So to what extent do you foresee those types of data being useful, and like just purely observational data from cyclists who upload their all their power meter data to Golden Cheetah or something like that?
Yeah, this is a great point. This is something that some people reached out to me about, and something that we certainly would do as future work. So for example, Swift or Golden Cheetah, they have these very big databases. So on Strata, you can find all this exercise data. One issue we have with this data is that it's not very controlled. So there might be, yeah, we don't really know about the conditions of the cycle ergometer, or we don't have the physiological parameters of the athletes. So we don't really have a ground truth that we can compare to. But there are some things we can do. For example, there have been trials on how to get critical power and W prime from these mean maximal efforts. So if you look at a big bout of training data, you can infer critical power and W prime from mean maximal efforts over certain times. And then you could take a competition where you can assume that W prime was depleted in the end and try to fit these models to that. So there is some opportunity, and certainly something that is worth investigating and that should be investigated. But compared to a lab study, it's harder to argue or harder to show that what you predict is actually true, or to compare it to something.
Yeah, for sure. It'd be interesting to see though, at some point. But yeah, you'd have to probably have some sort of annotation of as to where the maximal efforts might have been.
Yeah,
the problem with these observational studies.
Yeah, it's hard to tell whether the athlete really was exhausted at the end or not. Yeah.
All right, other questions? Well, maybe with that, we'll just stop the recording. And before I do, though, I just want to thank Fabian very much for an excellent talk, and providing some excellent insights into human performance physiology from a data science perspective. So thanks, Fabian.
Yeah, thank you all very much for having me. Thank you.